Welcome to the deep dive. We're tackling a big one today. An executive order signed on April 2nd, 2025 by President Trump focused squarely on the U.S. trade deficit.
hmm
You, our listener, sent in some really interesting thoughts beforehand, with ideas ranging from spending cuts to tariffs as ways to address national debt and boost long-term growth.
Yeah, it's good points there.
Definitely. While both are fascinating avenues, we're going to zero in on the tariff approach today, as that's really the core of this new order.
Makes sense.
Our mission here is simple: to break down what this order actually does, explore the thinking behind it, highlight the crucial parts, and discuss the potential ripple effects in the real world, all while keeping the economic jargon, to a minimum. Okay, let's unpack this.
That's right. And to really understand this executive order, you have to grasp the concept of a trade deficit first.
Right.
In essence, it means the U.S. is importing or, buying more goods and services from other countries than it's exporting or selling to them.
Okay, more coming in than going out.
Exactly. And this new order makes a pretty significant claim right off the bat.
Right.
It asserts that this ongoing trade deficit isn't just an economic issue. It's actually a threat to our national security.
Wow, okay. That framing definitely raises the stakes.
It really does.
So what's prompting this action now? What are the key arguments being made for this executive order at this particular moment?
Well, the order itself lays out several reasons. One of the first and most prominent is the idea of a lack of reciprocity.
Reciprocity, okay.
What's interesting here is the argument that many other countries impose higher tariffs and other kinds of barriers, think regulations or standards that are tough for U.S. companies to meet on goods coming in from the United States.
Yeah.
This makes it harder and, more expensive for American businesses to compete in those markets.
Mm-hmm.
The flip side, as the order presents it,
Yeah.
is that the U.S. has comparatively lower barriers, making it easier for foreign goods to enter our country.
Mm-hmm.
The goal here is to sort of level that playing field.
That makes intuitive sense. It feels a bit like playing a game where the other team has a head start,
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good analogy.
The order also mentions the economic situations in other countries. How does that factor into the thinking behind this?
Well, if we connect this back to why a trade deficit might exist, the argument is that in some countries that are major trading partners, factors like lower average wages or maybe less overall purchasing power among consumers can limit the demand for U.S.-made goods.
Okay.
If people simply can't afford to buy as much from American companies, that naturally contributes to the imbalance in trade.
Gotcha. And then there's the idea of structural imbalances within the global trading system itself. That sounds a bit more complicated.
Yeah, this raises a really important question about whether the current international rules and organizations governing trade are truly fair and effective.
Mm.
The order seems to suggest a belief that the existing framework hasn't been able to prevent the persistent growth of U.S. trade deficits, hinting that perhaps a new, more, let's say, assertive approach is needed.
So we're looking at a perceived lack of fairness in trade barriers, different economic realities in other nations, and a sense that the broader system isn't working as well as it should for the U.S.
Pretty much, yeah.
The order then connects these points to some pretty serious consequences, notably the hollowing out of American manufacturing. Can you elaborate on that connection?
Absolutely. The concern is that when American companies face higher hurdles selling their goods abroad while also facing fewer barriers for foreign goods coming into the U.S., there's a natural economic pressure to shift production to countries where costs might be lower.
Right, the path of least resistance economically.
Yeah, exactly. This can lead to factories closing down here in the U.S. and a decline in manufacturing jobs. It's the hollowing out effect.
Okay.
Beyond that economic impact, the order also emphasizes the increased reliance on foreign sources for essential goods, which raises potential vulnerabilities, especially concerning national security and the stability of supply chains, during times of crisis.
And it's clear from the order that the current administration doesn't think past efforts have been sufficient to address these problems.
That's definitely the narrative being presented. The idea is that previous trade agreements and negotiations haven't done enough to reverse these trends, necessitating a more direct and impactful policy.
Which brings us to the tariffs.
And that brings us to the central proposed solution: reciprocal tariffs.
Okay, reciprocal tariffs. That's the core mechanism. In straightforward language, what exactly does that entail?
At its core, it means the United States will impose taxes. These are the tariffs on goods being imported from other countries.
Just taxes on imports.
Basically, yeah.
Okay.
The main goal is to put pressure on those countries to adopt what the U.S. considers to be fairer trade practices. Think of it as using tariffs as a negotiating tool, really on the global stage.
Okay.
And as we mentioned earlier, the president has declared a national emergency related to this issue, which provides the legal basis for enacting this order under specific U.S. law.
Right. The emergency declaration is key legally. So let's dive into the specifics of this executive order. What are the crucial details that we, as listeners trying to understand this, really need to know? The timing seems like a key piece of information.
You're right. The order sets out a clear timeline. A general 10% tariff on all imports from all trading partners, with some important exceptions we'll discuss, is scheduled to take effect on April 5th, 2025.
Okay. That's soon.
Very soon. Additionally, for specific countries listed in Annex, and while our source doesn't detail which countries are in this annex, it's important to note that these exist higher tariff rates will kick in a few days later, on April 9th, 2025.
So different rates for different countries, potentially.
Potentially, yes.
Okay.
And there's also a crucial point for businesses.
Yeah.
Goods that were already in transit before these dates are specifically exempt, providing a bit of a buffer.
Ah, okay. That's important for logistics. So a broad 10% tariff initially, higher tariffs for some nations later. Now, you mentioned exemptions, and this is where we start to see the strategic considerations at play, right?
Exactly.
What are some of the key products or sectors that will not be subject to these new tariffs?
This is where it gets really interesting. Firstly, the order explicitly states that existing tariffs already in place on steel, aluminum, automobiles, and automotive parts will not be increased by this new 10% tariff.
So no double dipping on those.
Right. This suggests a targeted approach, aiming to broaden the tariff base rather than just piling onto sectors already facing these measures.
Okay.
Even more telling is Annex 2, which lists a set of key products that are entirely exempt.
Ah, the exemptions list.
Yes. These include copper, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, lumber, critical minerals, and energy products.
Wow, that's quite a list. Semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, very strategic.
Absolutely. This list offers a fascinating glimpse into what the administration considers strategically vital and areas where they likely want to avoid disrupting supply chains. For example, semiconductors are, the backbone of modern technology, from your phone to advanced defense systems, so ensuring their continued flow is crucial.
That makes perfect sense. That list definitely speaks volumes about priorities. What other exemptions are worth noting here?
There are a few other categories. Goods that are already covered under specific existing U.S. laws are exempt, although the specifics of those laws aren't detailed in our sources.
Okay.
Also, imports from countries that are already subject to very high tariffs under something called Column 2 of the Harmonized Tariff Schedule are excluded.
Column 2. Okay.
This likely means that goods from those nations are already facing substantial duties, so adding more isn't the focus here.
Got it.
Finally, goods that might be targeted by future tariffs under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, that's the one allowing tariffs based on national security concerns, are also exempt from this new order. So there are already mechanisms in place, or potentially in place, for certain goods and countries.
So it fits into a larger picture of trade tools. Now, what about our close neighbors, Canada and Mexico? They get a specific mention due to the USMCA trade agreement. How do these new tariffs apply to them?
Right, the USMCA creates a special situation. For goods that qualify as originating under the USMCA rules.
Meaning made mostly in North America.
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah.
Goods where a significant portion of their production or materials come from within the U.S., Canada, or Mexico,
Yeah.
based on specific agreed-upon criteria, they may be exempt from these new tariffs.
Okay, maybe.
It implies some conditions, yes. However, for goods coming from Canada or Mexico that do not meet those originating requirements, they could potentially face different tariff rates under this executive order. It really highlights the intricate web of international trade, especially within North America.
Definitely complex. Another really interesting aspect is the Made in America incentive. How does that work to encourage domestic production?
This is a pretty clever mechanism, actually. If a product being imported into the U.S. contains at least 20% of its value from components that were made in the United States.
Okay, 20% U.S. content.
Right. Then the new tariff will only be applied to the portion of the product's value that comes from foreign sources. The example provided is really clear. If you have a $100 item where $30 of its value is U.S. made and $70 is foreign, the 10% tariff would only be levied on that $70 foreign value.
So a $7 tariff instead of $10.
Exactly, resulting in a $7 tariff instead of the full $10. So the more American content a product has, the lower the tariff burden.
That's a smart way to directly incentivize companies to source more domestically. Very targeted.
It is.
The order also mentions foreign trade zones and low-value imports. What are the specific rules that apply there?
Okay, so for goods located within foreign trade zones, these are designated areas within the U.S., but legally considered outside of U.S. customs territory, sort of like a customs limbo.
Right.
The executive order lays out specific guidelines to ensure that the new tariffs are applied fairly once those goods eventually leave the zone and enter the U.S. market.
So no escaping the tariff just by sitting in a zone.
Correct. As for low-value imports, often called de minimis shipments, think of those smaller online purchases many of us make from overseas.
Yeah, happens all the time.
The order suggests that they might continue to receive duty-free treatment under existing regulations. This could soften the impact on individual consumers for those smaller transactions.
Okay, so my small online order might be safe. Potentially.
Potentially, yes.
Yay.
It looks like they're considering that aspect.
There's also a measure in place aimed at preventing countries from trying to circumvent these tariffs, specifically mentioning China, Hong Kong, and Macau.
Yes, that's important.
Right.
To prevent what's known as transshipment, where goods from one country, say China, are routed through another place, like Hong Kong, to try and avoid tariffs.
A classic loophole attempt.
Exactly. The executive order explicitly states that the tariffs applied to goods originating from mainland China will also apply to goods coming from Hong Kong and Macau. This is a move to close those potential loopholes and ensure the policy targets the intended sources of imports.
Makes sense. And it sounds like this isn't a set-in-stone policy. There's a degree of flexibility built in, right?
Absolutely. The president retains the authority to adjust these tariff rates based on a couple of key factors.
Like what?
One is if other countries retaliate by imposing their own tariffs on U.S. exports.
Tit for tat.
Basically. The other is if the overall trade situation evolves significantly. For example, if the U.S. trade deficit starts to decrease substantially, or, conversely, if it grows even larger, this adaptability suggests the policy can be modified in response to how things actually play out in the real world.
So it can be dialed up or down.
That seems to be the intention.
Finally, who are the government entities responsible for implementing and overseeing all of this, and is there any built-in accountability?
Good question. The executive order designates key government bodies to handle the implementation and enforcement. The Secretary of Commerce will likely play a significant role in defining the finer details of the tariffs and any additional regulations.
Okay.
U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP, will be on the ground, so to speak, actually collecting these tariffs at the border.
The front lines.
Exactly. And importantly, the administration is also required to provide regular reports to Congress on the National Emergency Declaration and the impact of these tariffs, ensuring a level of oversight from the legislative branch.
So Congress gets updates. Good to know.
Yes, there's a reporting requirement.
So we've really dug into the details of this executive order. Now let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. What are the fundamental goals that this policy is trying to achieve? Why should you, the listener, care about all these specifics?
Right, the why. The underlying goals are quite broad, actually. Firstly, as we've discussed at length, it's about putting pressure on other countries to lower their own trade barriers, striving for that reciprocity in international commerce.
Leveling the field.
Exactly. Secondly, a major objective is clearly to reduce the persistent U.S. trade deficit.
Shrink that gap.
Thirdly, the hope is that by making imported goods relatively more expensive, it will create an incentive for domestic companies to ramp up manufacturing here in the United States, leading, hopefully, to job creation.
Bring jobs back.
That's the idea. Fourthly, and closely tied to the national security argument we started with, it's about lessening the U.S.'s reliance on foreign supply chains, particularly for goods deemed critical.
More self-reliance.
Precisely. So, in simpler terms, the administration's aim is to make global trade fair for the U.S., to bring manufacturing jobs back home, and to strengthen our national economic security.
And naturally, a policy change of this magnitude isn't going to occur without potential consequences, right?
Yeah.
What are some of the key ramifications, both positive and negative, that we need to be aware of? It seems like there are differing views on how this might unfold.
Oh, absolutely.
As some of you, our listeners, pointed out, there are other potential solutions to national debt and economic growth, like government spending cuts, and the long-term effectiveness of tariffs compared to those alternative approaches remains a topic of, well, ongoing debate among economists.
That's a really crucial point to remember. This is one tool, one approach, and it has potential downsides. One potential outcome that gets a lot of attention is the possibility of higher prices for a wide range of imported goods that American consumers purchase regularly.
Yeah, stuff we buy every day.
Exactly, from clothing and electronics to household items that can hit people's wallets. Another significant concern is the risk of retaliatory tariffs being imposed by other countries on U.S. exports.
The other shoe dropping.
Right. This could have a negative impact on American industries, such as agriculture or certain segments of manufacturing that depend heavily on selling their goods overseas.
So farmers could get hit, for example.
That's a common concern, yes. On a larger scale, this policy could lead to shifts in global trade patterns, maybe supply chains rerouting, and potentially strain international relationships.
Yeah, diplomatic friction. It's possible. The administration argues, of course, that this is a necessary step to protect American interests in the long run, while critics express serious concerns about the potential economic costs and the risk of escalating trade disputes.
So, different viewpoints on whether the benefits outweigh the risks.
Very much so.
Okay, so to summarize, this deep dive has shown us that on April 2nd, 2025, President Trump signed an executive order declaring a national emergency related to the U.S. trade deficit and imposing reciprocal tariffs that are scheduled to begin taking effect very, very shortly.
That's the crux of it. April 5th and April 9th are the key dates.
The primary goals are to foster a more equitable landscape in international trade, to revitalize American manufacturing, and ultimately to strengthen the nation's economic future.
Exactly. It represents a significant shift in trade policy with potentially far-reaching consequences, both intended and perhaps unintended. And on that note, considering the intricate nature of global trade and the deep interconnectedness of our economies, what other unforeseen consequences might emerge from this substantial policy shift beyond the immediate concerns of consumer prices and international retaliation? It's definitely a complex issue with many layers to consider.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Predicting all the ripple effects is incredibly difficult.
Something to keep an eye on for sure. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.